Ilia Topuria and Conor McGregor ran through the featherweight division and both rose to become champion against super dominant opponents. So we're going to go out and see which one had the harder title run. Both of them taking 7 fights to get to the title makes this a lot easier. So both of their first fights, we have Youssef Zalal versus Marcus Brimage. So Youssef Zalal was 13-5 and now he's out of the UFC. He really had no notable wins, as well as Marcus Brimage was on a 3-fight win streak going into that fight. He went on to lose to Cody Garbrandt after that and is of course out of the UFC. Now, it's both of their first fights, so it's not the biggest deal, and every fight should be weighed a little bit differently. The first fight shouldn't matter that much, but that's clearly Conor's. Moving on to number 2, we have Damon Jackson versus Max Holloway, and I'm sure you guys all know where this is going, but you do have to remember, Max wasn't Max just yet. But Damon first, he's 22-6, he went on a 4-fight win streak after, and he went on to lose to Dan Ige and Billy Quarantillo. So that's actually a pretty notable resume, and that's honestly pretty decent record overall. Even though it's still his second fight, it's a pretty good test. But going up against Max Holloway, Max went on to have a 13-fight win streak after, and going into that fight, he was on a 3-fight win streak. And of course, Max Holloway wasn't exactly Max Holloway yet, but I think you can see, especially immediately after, Max Holloway is definitely the superior fighter. I don't think anyone will really dispute that, even though Max was a lot younger. So the number 2 is clearly Conor's. Number 3 is Diego Brandao against Ryan Hall. Now, I know Ryan Hall is a meme, and he's pretty funny to watch fight, and kind of annoying to watch fight, and he takes pulling guard to a whole nother level, but he was on an 8-fight win streak going into that fight, and he had a win after, whereas Diego Brandao fought Conor coming off a loss to Dustin Poirier, and he did go on a 2-fight win streak after, but then he lost to Ortega and is now out of the UFC. So, crazily enough, I think Ryan Hall is the superior fighter, despite the fact that that fight was an absolute meme. Ryan Hall did cause a lot of people a lot of problems with that stupid strategy, even though it sucks to watch and it's crazy to say. I think Ryan Hall is clearly the harder fight than Diego Brandao, because Brandao is definitely not as sharp as history remembers him to be. Now, a lot of this could be recency bias because a lot of the names on his resume aren't as recognizable as they were back then, but going into that fight coming off a loss versus Ryan Hall, who's on a win streak going into that fight, I think it's pretty clear who was the harder fighter there. So that one goes to Ilia. Coming into number 4, we have Jai Herbert versus Dustin, and this one is not close at all. Jai Herbert was 2 wins, 4 losses, and 1 no contest in the UFC. This fight also happened at lightweight, whereas Dustin was on a 3-fight win streak and proceeded to go on a 4-fight win streak after, before going up a weight class and becoming the interim lightweight champion. And Dustin had wins over Max Holloway at this point. Dustin was not as young as Max Holloway was into his career. Despite their ages being somewhat similar, Dustin was definitely seasoned at that time, whereas Jai Herbert was not any of that. Although that fight, Ilia was losing pretty bad until having a crazy comeback, and probably his craziest knockout until Volk. Of course, the fact that Jai Herbert pushed him, whereas Conor knocked out Dustin in the first round, I think it's pretty clear that Conor's number 4 is more impressive. Now, the fact that it was at lightweight, for one, it's the future to tell what Ilia would look like at lightweight. This fight is kind of awkward, and it doesn't really make much sense in the grand scheme of his resume, but Conor also has some weird ones later on. Coming into number 5, we have Bryce Mitchell versus Dennis Siver. Now, Dennis Siver is an on and off fighter, and he's 23-11 overall. He lost to Cowboy Cub Swanson. He did beat BJ Penn though, but it seems like in a lot of Dennis Siver's big spots, he ended up going out and losing. Whereas Bryce Mitchell was undefeated at that time, and it was an undefeated versus undefeated. It was Ilia's first real test, although Jai Herbert was technically a test, it really wasn't supposed to be. And Bryce Mitchell had beat Barboza, and after losing to Ilia, he beat Dan Ige. Now, Bryce Mitchell did claim that he was sick going into that fight, and to be honest, he was fighting in slow motion, and it did seem like he was a little sick. But when you're in a debate like this, you can't really weigh that in, because overall, Bryce Mitchell was supposed to pose a lot of problems, and Ilia went out there and submitted him. It wasn't even like he knocked him out, he submitted him. Bryce Mitchell, who was supposed to be an elite grappler. So I think overall, it's really clear to see Bryce Mitchell is better, because Dennis Siver looked like he shouldn't have been in there with Conor, although a lot of people thought Conor was going to struggle based off Dennis's build, because Dennis is built like a mini Hulk. I think in the end, you would still give this one to Ilia, because Bryce had a lot of hype going into it, and Dennis seemingly lost to every notable name at featherweight at the time. And before we get to the next one, if you've been enjoying this video so far, if you could leave a like, subscribe, I would really appreciate it. These videos take a long time to make, and I hope you guys are enjoying them, so let's get back to it. Coming into number 6, we have Chad Mendes versus Josh Emmett. In researching for this video, I honestly was shocked at how elite Chad Mendes is, and honestly, I think I and everyone else else has slept on Chad really bad. He's only lost to champions. He has 2 losses to Aldo, 1 to Conor, 1 to Frankie Edgar, and 1 to Volkanovski. That is crazy. It's important to note that both of these guys are the same age as 38, and Chad Mendes has more knockouts than him, which is also really crazy because Josh Emmett is known as the knockout guy. Josh Emmett did beat Michael Johnson, Dan Ige, and knocked out Bryce into a different dimension, which is important to take note of. But he had a very close fight with Calvin Kattar, and he was coming off an interim title loss to Yair, which was not close either. And his fight against Ilia, I believe he literally got 50-42 on one of the cards. That could be wrong. I believe he got hit with the 10-7. So although he won the fight after, I think we still have to see where Josh Emmett has to go from here, because it seems like his career has a little bit of life left to it. But he did have some notable wins before as well, and Josh Emmett has always been that guy who was right there but never got that title shot. And given his build, he probably would have posed Volk a couple issues. He would have lost, don't get me wrong. He was going to lose, but Josh Emmett is an elite fighter. But him and Chad Mendes have similar issues in they've always lost the big fights. Overall, it's hard to weigh this because Chad gave Conor some issues in that first round until getting knocked out, whereas Ilia, even though he didn't knock Josh Emmett out, he might as well have, because he beat him up horribly for 5 rounds. And Josh Emmett also only has 4 losses on his resume as well. Chad is still fighting in BKFC, but I think overall I might have to give this to Josh Emmett, given the fact that Josh Emmett is super dangerous on the feet. He has knocked people out, and Chad was coming into that on 2 weeks notice. Now Conor was going into that on 2 weeks notice too, but Conor also had a torn ACL, so I understand there's a lot of factors in this that make this really hard to pick who is better than who. But I think overall I'm gonna go with Josh Emmett because of how Ilia beat him, because what Josh Emmett went on to do after, and just the fact that Josh Emmett is still knocking people out. Now we get to Jose Aldo Volkanovski, and I honestly don't know where to start, because Aldo had been undefeated from 2006 to 2015 when this fight happened, but Volkanovski is universally looked at as a featherweight GOAT, but he's a featherweight GOAT because he beat Aldo, beat Max 3 times, and beat basically everyone in his division. Aldo going into that fight was undefeated for 10 years, whereas Volkanovski was coming off 2 losses and one of them being a knockout, and he had a relatively quick turnaround for someone that got knocked out cold. I honestly have no idea where to go with this because Volkanovski is looked at as a harder fight because he's a featherweight GOAT, but Aldo was the featherweight GOAT at the time and was undefeated for so long throughout the WEC and the UFC run, and he had beat everyone, literally everyone he could beat, and Conor knocked him out in 13 seconds, whereas Ilia knocked him out in the second round, but that's not really that big of a difference. Although Ilia lost the first round, he put him out cold too. I think overall I'm going to give this to Jose Aldo and Conor because of the fact that Jose Aldo was only a year older than Conor. Although I know in the press conference run, Conor had us all believing Aldo was way older than him, but he was 29 and Conor was 28. And Volkanovski was 35 coming off 2 losses. So although Volkanovski is the featherweight GOAT, if you look at it on a resume perspective of when they fought each other, I would give it to Conor. I believe in scoring this, Conor is the winner of this debate in this sense, but you have to think about it like this. Every fight should be weighed differently. For example, your first fight is not weighed the same as your title contender fight or your title fight. So if you think that Ilia had the harder run, I can see where you're coming from, but I think even taking into weighing it fights differently and everything like that, I still think I would give it to Conor. Max Holloway, Dustin Poirier, Chad Mendes, Jose Aldo, whereas with Ilia you have Bryce Mitchell, Josh Emmett, Volk, but then like the Jai Herbert, Ryan Halls are not as impressive, and even though Ryan Hall has gone on to go on a win after, I think the first half of his run is way weaker than Conor's first half. I don't know if there's going to be much debate around this topic either, because I think generally people look at Conor's title run to be super impressive. Like, he did get tested and was no way gifted a title shot. If you want to check out an entire career debate between Conor McGregor and Khabib, that one is way closer than you think it is. That video is here, and if you enjoyed this video, leave a like, subscribe. Don't forget, we're just getting started. We're going to stay consistent, and I'll see you in the next video.